go on to the next issue here. This House believes that the P&I industry in 2023 will look very similar to that of today, or will it become over-regulated and run by government bodies via the clubs? So for the motion, Joe Hughes of the American.
I have the IT now. There he is. Very good. Calimera, sir. There was a former colleague of mine once said, in this very room, actually, calamari, everyone. Splendid, thank you. I'm going to be a very clever dick now, courtesy of left in Nicky, actually, and look into my crystal ball and see what we have in relation to the future, the next 10 years. And the motion is that this House believes that the P&I industry of 2023 will look very similar to that of today, or will it become over-regulated and run by government bodies via the clubs? To begin with, let's look at where we are now today in 2013. I'll go through this quite quickly. These are the salient features I submit of where the group stands at the present time, more than the group, in fact, the industry in general. The IG Consumer Collective pretty much is in the ascendant. Perhaps the word dominated is appropriate. It's certainly in the ascendant over the blue water space. And I suggest that the IG model supplies unsurpassed security and fosters diversity. The security, of course, is represented by the collective strength of the international group and the reinsurance arrangements that it has in common amongst the clubs. And the diversity is, as I referred to before here, the Bergdorf-Goodman effect, the fact that individual clubs can provide their own particular servicing, their own particular culture, as it were, at their points of contact with the industry as a whole, and therefore differentiate themselves accordingly, while at the same time benefit from the overarching strength of the entire group. Now, I'm going to get some brickbats here, but I do think that the IG model represents excellent value for the ocean-going constituency. The fixed premium market flourishes in parallel with this for smaller ships, so there is diversity in a broader sense within the industry. Clubs are expanding their product lines. Some indeed have had relatively expanded product lines for some time, but others are now moving into different areas, the American Club being one, of course, with Eagle Ocean Marine fixed premium facility. Regulatory burdens of all kinds are growing. We've heard that referred to earlier. The IG, to its great credit and with great efficiency, manages the issue of global regulation with very powerful and collective voice. That's an enormous strength of the group that's often, I think, overlooked. It does actually act very, very effectively for the industry as a whole in dealing with liability matters that are increasing all the time. And of course, clubs themselves must respond to the individual oversight that they to which they are subject by way of local regulation and so on. The FSA and Solvency II being a notable case in point in Europe, but in the United States too, there are growing requirements of the local insurance regulators under the NAIC requirements for risk-based capital and so on. I think that all clubs will admit that they face common challenges in what is a difficult market at present and is likely to remain difficult for some time. Operating results, of course, as Rolf Torder and Tord indicated earlier on, the question of combined ratio, actual operating results remains problematical across the group as a whole. Investment returns are likely to be much less opulent, shall we say, over the years ahead for a variety of reasons. Customer expectations always will continue to grow, and quite rightly so, and the group is well designed to respond to them. Regulatory demands are going to continue to grow, no doubt about that. And I think that the human capital issue, the need to ensure that the international group clubs and indeed the industry as a whole continues to attract the brightest and the best, will be a challenge for all of us as we go into the next decade. So, looking into the next decade, what are going to be, in your correspondence view here, the likely trends? Well, I think that rising claims are going to be a feature of that, and that is obviously going to impel a degree of price escalation in an underlying sense. I think that reinsurance is likely to continue to become more costly. Obviously, it has notoriously become more expensive at this particular renewal in the light of a number of significant casualties in recent times. And I think there's likely to be greater risk absorption over time. There has been, as you'll be aware, at the forthcoming renewal increase in individual, in both in the individual club retentions and in terms of the attachment point to the RI up from $60 to $70 million. I think that service and regulatory demands will have an enlarging tendency upon administrative expense going forward. Proliferating liability regimes will continue and cause an amplification of exposures and certification needs. The needs for certification is something that's very important, obviously, to the shipowning community, and I think the international group is uniquely well positioned in that context to provide that response to growing bureaucracy across the world. There will be the intensifying oversight on the way in which clubs are governed and indeed managed will weigh on the management and the way in which boards operate. I think that the burgeoning global regulation that I referred to just now will actually enhance the collective voice or magnify the value of the IG's collective role over the next decade. I think the product diversification is a good thing for the clubs for a variety of reasons, not only in terms of spreading risk, where that is in fact happening within a particular portfolio, but it also attracts a broader range of people into the industry. And referring back to my point about human capital, I think that's a very important consideration also. And I think that the international group model, as it's currently constituted, and as I suggest is likely to remain for the next decade, remains well designed to confront these new challenges. So what is the P&I industry of 2023 likely to be? What will the salient features, how will they emerge? I think that the IG Consumer Collective will continue to be in the ascendant in regard to the blue water space. I think that it will continue to supply unsurpassed security, and the diversity that's intrinsic to the way it's organised at the moment will continue. I think that it will continue to provide excellent value. But I think it will be more expensive there, because I think all the trends that I've been just referring to will inevitably have to drive up costs, not only, of course, in nominal terms over the next decade, whatever the rate of inflation globally happens to be over that time, but also in real terms. I think that the fixed premium market will continue to remain important, although it may be that some of the players in that market at the moment may have been consolidated in some way. I mean, there's a lot of players in that particular space, and I think that there is a possibility that some will retrench out of it over time. I think that we will, as clubs collectively, maintain product diversity, but it may be some of the things that some clubs are going into at the moment may in fact be retrenched again over time. But I think that it will be a feature of the market as we see it in the next 10 years. I think that compliance demands by 2023 will have stabilized. I think that once we've gone through the frontier of Solvency II in particular, and its equivalent in North America and perhaps in other parts of the world, I think that there probably won't be much development except accretional development beyond that stage. But I think that the regulatory demands in 2023, unless of course Solvency II has been ultimately postponed beyond that, which is unlikely, will probably have stabilized, but they will be unremittingly intense. I think that the international group, because of the ascendancy that it has, as I referred to, will continue its collective management of global regulation. I think that clubs will obviously continue to have their own responses to global oversight, and those responses will become more burdensome over time for the clubs. I think that they will continue to face many of the same sort of challenges inevitably, because they are not-for-profit, because they do respond very closely, probably more than any other industry, arguably, to the circumstances of their members being mutuals, true mutuals, owner-owned collectives. And I think that there will still be issues of operating results and investment returns. If we've looked over the last 15 to 20 years at an average investment return of whatever it might be in the equity market, 7% per annum or so, obviously it varies a lot, there's a great deal of volatility in that. I think going forward, for reasons of demography, reasons of relative productivity and so on, that will probably reduce substantially to say 3 or 4%, or at least most of the pundits on the subject suggest that's the case. I think there'll be challenges that continue in regard to customer expectations, and regulatory demands, as I suggested, would also be very much a strong feature. What I've done in the next section is actually viewed those crystal balls in somewhat more detail, and sticking my neck out a bit, tried to look at certain scenarios and give them a likelihood as a percentage of 100% being dead certainty, and 50% being, well, half one way or the other, or an inequality of outcome, perhaps. And I want to share these with you. The first scenario I've looked at is that the element, substance, and the operation of cover, actually the basic cover and the way in which the clubs do business, will not have changed within the next decade. And I never say never, suggests that you can't have perhaps 100% in that particular column, but 90% I think is a fair assessment of the likelihood of that being the case. I think that cover limits overall will probably be unchanged. There are very high figures at the moment. There may be some move to amend them in some respects, depending upon circumstances as yet unforeseen that may emerge over time, so I'm ascribing 70% to that. I think that radical changes, by which I mean a fundamental reorganisation of the way that individual club retentions and the pool are set, is less than 50-50 over that period. So I think that the manner in which things are structured now, give or take accretional changes, is probably unlikely to change very much over the next 10 years. Clearly there's going to be more global liability overall, initiatives and regulation. There will be more direct liability, the blue card type responsibility that ship owners will face over the years ahead. That, I think, is a 90% likelihood. Clearly more regulatory compliance locally, a more predatory claims climate for sure. The problem, I think, in an overarching sense, that the shipping community has as an industry, utterly vital though it is to international trade and global economic well-being, is that it has very little political leverage on a global scale. It certainly has political leverage in certain parts of the world, here in Greece obviously, and in Scandinavia and so on. But if you compare the shipping industry writ large with, say, the banking industry or the financial services industry, the amount of political leverage they have, and therefore influence on regimes and the hostility of the jurisprudential environment and all that sort of thing, is very much more limited than other markets. And that means that it's easier for claimants to get what they want, or to be aggressive against ship owners in individual ports, or for new regulations castigating ship owners for this, that, and the other to emerge. I mean, Jacques Chirac, as you may remember in regard, I think it was the Erika, referred to ship owners as these gangsters of the seas. Coming from Monsieur Chirac, that is a particularly rich comment, as you might imagine, actually. But that is that kind of political view that I think is a debilitating feature. And one of the great questions that the shipping community has always asked itself, really, is how do we actually influence things? How do we make the general public, the world public, if you will, understand just how vitally important we are? And until that's achieved, I think it just will be difficult for ship owners, which of course has a knock-on effect of making it very important for clubs who stand in the shoes of ship owners in so many circumstances like this to rise to the challenge and make sure that they protect the ship owners' interests. So far as individual claims are concerned, and the claims climate generally, I think it's very likely, and this is something again that my colleagues Rolf Tore and Tord referred to earlier, that the severity of individual retained claims, that is to say at the absorbed level by individual clubs and their own retention, will increase in real terms probably by maybe more than 50% over that period, not just in nominal terms, but in real terms. And again, I think that individual catastrophe claims with convention creep and the increasing politicisation of claims against owners, the big claims in particular, will probably rise in that order over the period. I think the incidence of claims, though, will probably be somewhat more stable. I think we found this at the American Club, and I think probably most of the other clubs have seen a similar development as a result of loss prevention initiatives and the increasing efficiency in terms of the profile of loss within the shipping industry, that the actual incidence of claims has not risen quite as much as their individual severity, either at a relatively low level or at the higher levels represented by catastrophe claims. So I think that's probably a 50-50 development. Club governance, there's quite a lot of talk about that actually. A lot of it's occurring in the context of, again, FSA requirements. To say perhaps there's a major restructuring of traditional forms of club governance is perhaps too strong an expression, but I think that there will be, over the next decade, certain changes in the manner in which clubs are governed, or the importance at least in which governance as an element of club operation is treated both by regulators and indeed by the clubs and their memberships themselves. I think that the average cost in real terms of the primary cover is bound to go up over the next decade. I think, for all the reasons that I've described, it's a sad reality that things will just have to get more expensive, and one hopes obviously that the freight markets improve dramatically, which of course they will in the fullness of time to match that, but in the meantime the clubs are doing their very best, as I think again Gordon Rothschild said, to try and mitigate the full effects of rising prices at this and perhaps subsequent renewals. I do see that all the international group clubs, as they are currently constituted within the group, the 13, will remain as they are today. I regard that as an 80% probability, and conversely, or correlatively, I think the chances of mergers, although that may indeed happen, I think that it's not as likely as some outside commentators might like to think, because of the intrinsic advantages of, as I described earlier, the diversity that the international group can provide under the way that it's currently operated. So my conclusions, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, in support of the motion, which I hope that you will in fact vote for, is that the business climate in 2023 will be more testing. I think that's pretty much a platitude. The liability environment for ship owners in particular will be more hostile. The customer regulatory and governance expectations will be high. P&I will be more expensive, but I think that it will still offer exceptional value to those who purchase it, to those for whom it is designed to provide a benefit. I think that there will be greater diversification of the beyond the core business of the clubs, and as I said earlier, I think that's a good thing for a variety of reasons, and greater entrepreneurship outside the mutual core. But I think the essential club values, the IG design and its modus operandi, will indeed remain the same in 10 years' time, because the IG and the club model are well designed, I suggest, to confront new challenges. They've been around for a very, very long time, and there is no reason to expect that they will not remain in existence in fundamentally the form they have now for a very long time to come. So, the P&I industry, I conclude, and I suggest that you agree with me in this conclusion, will indeed look very similar to that of today, it will not be completely overrun by bureaucrats, though I suggest that they will certainly not stop trying to do that. But I think that overall we'll be in pretty much the same sort of position as we are now. And that, ladies and gentlemen, leads me to the conclusion of my arguments for the motion. I humbly request that you support it when the vote comes. I also want to share with you, actually, something that's just come from the Associated Press, actually in Washington. I'm extremely well connected with what the Washington Press call. You all know what Obamacare is, I take it. The new socialized medicine scheme that's being introduced. Well, the American Medical Association very recently, I think it was yesterday or the day before, had a meeting to discuss what their response should be to it. And they came up with certain, they divided up into their different specializations, and they came up with certain conclusions. The allergists decided that it would be best to scratch it. The dermatologists said that there should be no rash moves. The gastroenterologists had a bad gut feeling about the whole thing. The neurologists thought that President Obama had a nerve to put it forward at all. The obstetricians thought that the entire scheme was labouring under a misconception. The ophthalmologists said that Obamacare was short-sighted. The pathologists said, over my dead body. The paediatricians thought the government needed to grow up. The psychiatrists thought the whole idea was madness. The radiologists, of course, could see right through it. The surgeons wanted to wash their hands of the whole thing. And plastic surgeons thought that Obamacare put a completely new face on the entire question of healthcare. The anesthesiologists, of course, thought the whole thing was a gas. But the cardiologists didn't have the heart to say no. In the end, the urologists said they were pissed off at the whole idea. And the proctologists, you don't know what proctologist is. It's an American expression, but I'll do this. Summed it all up by saying that the a-holes in Washington should all stick it in a place with which they, the proctologists, were very familiar.
Thanks, Joe. So, against the motion, Marc Jackson of the UK.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I should just tell you that the knee brace is on not as an impression of Robocop, but purely to gain the sympathy vote for later on. Yep. Excuse me.
So you've given up already?
This House believes that the P&I industry in 2023 will look very similar to that of today, or will become over-regulated and run by the government bodies via the clubs. So effectively, will the governments and regulators have taken control? To start with, I think there's one thing that can be said with little fear of contradiction. As well as death and taxes, one certainty in life is change. I think this photo of me as a young man is quite illustrative. Whether I've changed because of the affliction of time or the regulation of being married for the best part of 20 years, who can tell? But I think the point I'm trying to make is the industry over time has changed, and it has changed, I suspect, and put forward, as largely as a result of regulation. I think future changes resulting from legislation and regulation are inevitable. What I'd like to do today is to go through some of the regulation-based changes that we've seen over the years, maybe have a little look about how these have impacted on the industry generally, and then have a look at maybe some further impacts and changes going forward. Okay, so little Mr. Cruz. I don't go through these items in detail because time does not permit, but obvious examples of legislation that have affected shipowning and the P&I industry is recently MARPOL, both in terms of emissions in low sulphur, garbage disposal. The Bunker Convention, a prime example of the lack of political impact we can have in an industry, is the Chinese SPROs. They were brought in straight away. This is what's happening. Now, the international group did rather well on this because the international group stepped in, negotiated the actual contract, and the P&I clubs have taken an active role across the board in making sure that the member is properly represented, that the contracts are agreed properly, advising on the general area. You also need to look at general liability, criminal liability across the board. That has increased as a whole, and that puts much greater stress on ship owners, their crews and the master in particular, and that also has a knock-on effect with the P&I industry. These things all have to be known, dealt with, and looked at. Focus briefly on the United States. Just take one example of the oily water separator legislation. That's grown up an almost cottage industry on its own. And also you've got the additional problem of many states bringing up their own individual ways of dealing with pollution and contingency planning. So there's a wide variety. Bear in mind, we're in a global industry here, and we're looking at this across the board, just not in isolated incidents. Another example, the ISPS code. Increased cost of compliance with security measures. They all add another burden. Earlier, the EU involvement was mentioned. The EU is very strong on anti-corruption, anti-competition, I beg your pardon, which has been seen on a number of high-profile major companies that have been fined. And nothing happened as a result of the last investigation, as it were. It didn't lead to any substantial changes, but that's not to say that it could not in the future. The EU has that power, and it could well step in the future and make some substantial changes. Moving on, sanctions are a key point of this. The EU, UN and US regulations are very wide-ranging, and they do have a very noticeable effect upon how ship owners are able to trade in certain parts of the world. And I think the key one at the moment is Iran. Only a couple of days ago, President Obama, who's getting quite a good press here today, he signed into law the Iran Freedom and Counter-Proliferation Act of 2012. And that is aimed at expanding the territorial reach of US sanctions. Again, another example, government involvement, government sanctions being brought in to shape the way our industry is moving. Another point about the sanctions, just as an aside almost, is they do actually have a very real effect on how we as clubs can deal with genuine claims without falling foul of the sanction-making bodies to make sure that the funds don't get into the hands of the designated individuals. You know, a real problem for owners and clubs alike. Money laundering, that's a key topic as well. We all expected to know our clients far more than we ever did before. The prospect of a startup company just popping into the shipping industry now, very slim it seems to me, becoming increasingly difficult, and it's going to become increasingly difficult going forward. The UK Bribery and Corruption Act is very far-ranging, very wide-ranging. It has an impact about how business is done. In essence, if you're working for a UK-based or related company, there can be no suggestion whatsoever of an inducement or bribe being given. It's completely out of the question. The penalties are really quite stringent, both for companies and individuals. The other point is that, you say that the little facilitation payment to the guy who's looking at the hold in the Brazilian port, or the guy who's going to make sure your ship gets into berth next. All illegal. You can't do that anymore. All, again, down to government regulation. Going forward, what can we expect? I'm not going to look into my crystal ball as Joe did, but I think there's some fairly obvious ones that come out straight away. The Hazardous and Noxious Substances Convention, and the Athens Convention, which has already come into force in the EU, which is having an impact on passenger liability regulation, limits the LLMC and the Removal Convention, just to name two. We mentioned earlier the two big incidents recently, the Renner and the Costa Concordia. Full wreck removals, they're going to cost a fortune. It's going to have a big impact across the industry without wishing to hark back again to the reinsurance costs. This is a direct impact again. And this regulation and the attitude and activities of local and national governments is having that sort of effect across the board. So, I think it is easy to say, and conclude as a sort of three-quarter way, that there is a lot of change has been brought about as a result of legislation and regulation. I don't think that's going to change, but it hasn't stopped the P&I industry from functioning. That's a key point. I'd like to move briefly onto Solvency II. Solvency II, I think, was much misunderstood at the outset, and although it's much more recognised now. It was brought up into effect to address four key failings of insurers in the past. The technical and professional failings of individuals and management systems, a lack of appreciation by the insurers of its own risk appetite, and then also to do with corrupt or criminal activity, and external pressures such as shareholders looking to maximise their profit at the expense of insurers being properly capitalised. So that's really the starting point. Now, I'm not going to go into Solvency II in detail. It's, it's a subject all of its own. We can talk about it for days. But what I'd really like to say is it's going to have an impact on how clubs organise their finances and capitalise themselves. But without looking at it necessarily as a negative, I think it can be looked as a positive, because for the customer, if you have a properly capitalised, secure insurance organisation, then that can only be a good thing. Now, what I'd like to just do now quickly is to give an illustrative example of how interaction with the authorities can have a beneficial effect. What the UK Club did when Solvency II came around was to take a very positive view with dealing with the regulatory authorities. And rather than accepting what is effectively a rule-based diktat thought of, I think somebody said in some random office in Brussels, what we've done is actually carried a huge amount of work to create a capital model. And that capital model demonstrates how the claims and other risk activities can be dealt with, and the ability of the premium and accrued free reserve capital to deal with those eventualities as and when they come. The model has been examined by the regulators in some detail, and they like it, they've approved it. So effectively, what we've got now is the club has written its own rules, which have been approved by the regulators, and the focus now really, rather than thinking, oh my God, what the hell are you going to do with Solvency II, is to say, right, we know what we have to do with Solvency II, we can work on this. Now, that's an illustrative point. Taking it more generally, by taking a proactive approach to regulation and compliance, principles and sensible systems can be agreed with the regulatory authorities, and that has an additional benefit of building relationships and credibility. And that translates across different jurisdictions as well, because we can turn around and say, yes, we understand Solvency II in the UK. That gives a big tick when you talk to the regulator in the States or Australia or Switzerland. So it all builds up and it's all useful stuff. I'm coming towards the end now. I think two further points I'd like to make. Really, regulation and legislation have long affected the shipping and P&I industries, and they're going to continue to do so. I think it's inevitable, and I think even Joe, who was arguing the other side of the court, agreed that in his presentation. The key point may not be actually to determine whether the regulators are running the clubs, but really to make sure that the clubs and the international group are sufficiently proactive in their dealings to make sure that we can actually assist in making sure that the legislation that comes in is moulded to, and we can mould to fit it, rather than just being simply imposed upon us. Now, it may be that this is difficult because it's been mentioned before, there's a lack of political leverage, and that is the real concern that I have in opposing the motion. The clubs and the international may not have sufficient power to withstand this regulatory onslaught. I certainly hope they do. But to conclude, I'm going to borrow from the British Prime Minister, who gave a speech yesterday. In that speech he said, I believe that confronting this issue, shaping it, leading the debate, not simply hoping a difficult decision will go away. Now, Mr. Cameron said that in relation to whether or not Britain should go for full membership of the EU. But I suggest that has a very real impact and should be the way in which the P&I clubs and the international group are going to succeed in maintaining their position and not allowing the regulators to have their say. But as I say, whether we have the political power to do it is a very different matter. In conclusion, Uncle Sam votes against this motion.
Thank you, Mark. Would you bring the microphone? Hello, George, you must just take it. You want to do this or do you want to take it right now?
Thank you. For those who know me, I have a deep resentment for regulation of any sort. Very deep. And unfortunately, we are being over-regulated by everybody. Not only in general, but in our industry. There are too many bodies regulating us, too many regional bodies, too many international bodies, too many governments who are subject to different types of regulation in each port we go through, so forth and so on. So that's a reality. The P&I club system, mutual system, is good, and it will be pretty much the same as it is today 10 years from now. I certainly hope, I strongly hope, and strongly believe that we can avoid allowing overregulation to shape the way that we will be insuring our vessels and covering our social liability. And I do think that we should be much more active as an industry in trying to make sure that the trend that we have experienced over the past, I don't even know how many years, 10, 20 years, of increased liability for the ship owner stops somewhere, or at least there's a brake put on it, and we keep it under check, which we are not doing because we get carried away. In the good market, we're carried away with the fact that it's a good market. In the bad market, we're carried away with the fact that it's a bad market that we have to survive. And we've got to see a bit of the larger picture, make sure that we don't submit totally to these over-regulators who have nothing better to do than to be proctologists, as Joe said, or clever dicks, as Mr. Piraeus said. The point is that we do have to put a break this and say enough is enough and take it from there. However, I do think the system in general will be about the same in 10 years from now. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not very sure whether both Marc and Joe have voted for or against the change, because the word change is not really, it's a very strong word. I think probably evolution would be a more appropriate word. I mean, the clubs have been around and will probably be around in more or less the same fashion. They are facing a challenging environment, and going forward, I think everybody agrees that we are going to be facing a lot of political and bureaucratic, let's say, challenges. So the real question is whether the clubs will evolve to include the challenging of these new regulations. And my point is, I think the international group as an entity, the international group should advance, should become a much more vocal entity. It should probably join the round table, it should join PIMCO, ICS, Intertango, in jointly going to Brussels, having permanent people representing us as an industry in Brussels, and fighting our corner. There are so many regulations coming as of this year and going forward that we're going to see the emissions, which is a huge matter going forward, and the clubs haven't even really tackled that issue. I mean, I know because we have some of us involved in some other industry bodies, and this has been going on for like the last 5-6 years at a very high level. And we know, first of all, the MEPC in May is going to be taking a vote on the proposals as to how the industry will be taxed for these emissions. So these are very, very important things that the international group, as an organization, should actively get involved in going forward. Now, coming to whether the clubs would really change, I think, yes, the clubs will probably become larger insurance entities. They will start insuring other types of shipping related, probably commodities as well. It makes total sense. They have the knowledge, as Joe said, they have the tremendous expertise, great quality people involved, and as we all know, the shipping industry is not really paying lots of money for the quality lawyers or the quality handlers, because there are so many other industries that are paying much more. So it will be a challenge going forward trying to find these people. So we might as well use the quality that we have right now in the P&I system to try and increase the scope of business that the P&I clubs do. Thank you.
So, Marc, Joe, any sort of comments to the commentators?
No, not. Well, sorry, shall I go first? Can you hear me? No, not really. I think I'm encouraged that the general direction of my thesis was supported by both of them. I think. Of course, those in the audience will note that. I think that the underlying structures are very sound. There are challenges ahead. The human capital challenge is a particularly large one, I think, going forward. And I think that all of us in this group, particularly people like myself, coming more towards the end of one's career than right at the beginning of it, are encouraged by the people we have coming up behind us, and be able to pass on the torch of P&I virtue over the years ahead. It's a great industry to be involved in, actually, and I think that while things like banking and so on may have been arguably regarded as more attractive in the mid-80s until relatively recently, I think that P&I careers will increasingly be regarded as very appealing, attractive, and certainly very fulfilling ways of spending one's time and developing one's career going forward.
Not a great deal really to what had been said. I think the concern really from my side of the table is not necessarily that the structure of the clubs is going to change, but whether the clubs will be permitted by the regulatory bodies to operate independently as they wish to operate, and whether the influence of the regulatory bodies across the world will be such as to basically mean that as the motion suggests, that the regulatory bodies are those that are running the show in the real world. I'm not saying I particularly want that to happen, but my submission is that it's a very, very real risk unless we as an industry take quite substantial steps to combat that.
So we go to the floor. Mick, do we have a microphone?
Yes, whoever, Mr. Gourdomichalis, all my allies. The proliferation of rules and regulation is a scandal, a great scandal. And I think the industry should do something about it. It was said that it was political and that we don't get involved in politics. Yet, the big shipyards run the show. They love new regulations because they manipulate them as they want and they build ships as they want. Now, whether these ships can carry safety to carry cargo, according to the UA Club, is another matter. The classification societies on which we rely are deeply involved in the making of rules and regulations. Not their own rules and regulations about the strength of ships, but about the manning of ships, about the painting of ships, about the electricity of ships, and all sorts of things. Now, there is a Greek saying which says, what do we do? And perpatame xipoliti stangathia. This is Agatha Christie walking barefoot amongst the thorns. So, what should we do to defend ourselves with all these shipyards and whoever who do the regulations? I think that the club is a precious ally. The UK club, many years ago, or perhaps still do, issued some booklets called Safely to Carry. They have the clubs have a lot of knowledge, and so have the managers, or anyway, the owners. They should pull this together to face the big powers and the politics who do these regulations. They don't know what they are all about. The industry can face, how shall we say, demolition, deletion, or a disaster if too many regulations stop the ships in port. So I think that we should vote against the rule. We should vote certainly against all these new rules and regulations. Thank you.
The back.
I should like to ask a question of you, Mr. Chairman, if I may. I wonder how strong a sense of ownership you have as a ship owner of the international group. And if you don't have a strong sense of ownership, Who does?
Well, I think the international group are doing a reasonable job, as already been stated. But I think we have to be much more proactive. And I take all the comments that Mickey has said and George. At the end of the day, legislation is coming in on the financial side. Solvency II is going to affect us. We're not going to be able to control our own destinies. I mean, the boards of most of the clubs have taken the Scandinavian system now. There's going to be much more reduced boards and a bigger committee, which in reality means less people controlling the whole situation. So I think the IG is doing as good a job as it can, but it's very difficult, and we need to have more political influence if we're going to get anywhere. That's my view.
I think that's a very, very fair question that was just posed. I think I made in my earlier comment a very clear point that the IG should beef up its operations definitely going forward. It needs to face the oncoming challenges, which are humongous. And obviously resources need to be put in place in order to fund this expansion and this ever-increasing involvement. There is an overlooked suggestion that the EU made more than 20 years ago during its first review of the international group and the IGA. I think it was a 1989 report. And there is a very small but very important suggestion that as there is an international group that somehow promotes the interests of the international group at the international level, there was a suggestion that a similar group made up by ship owners or, let's say, members of boards and committees should equally be established that would work in tandem with the international group in order to promote the industry's interests. So that is probably something that maybe we as members, we as board members, we as committee members should look at establishing in order to assist the international group with its ever-increasing duties going forward.
I think the difficulty with that is actually getting sort of 11 chairmen together, if you like. Presumably the chairman of each club would be the appropriate person to represent the ship owners. And actually getting these 11 guys together, I'm not sure it would be so simple, even if desirable. But I mean, there must be ways that we can promote it. But it's going to be very difficult to actually stop going forward. As we can see now with the sanctions, how do you stop the Americans working the sanctions and where we pay all the bills? So, I mean, I don't see how the IG, or however they represent themselves in America, in Washington, could actually get that achieved. I mean, but anyway, I mean, is there any actually other, on the floor, any other questions?
Has there been any analysis of how much it costs for this regulation, how much it increases the cost of carrying the goods around the world? 90% of goods are carried by sea. Has there ever been any attempt by the IG or anybody else to work out how much it is increasing the cost of cornflakes we eat in the morning for breakfast, all this regulation? Because it's reflected in the freight and the hire, presumably, somewhere, and the price of the commodities that we're moving.
Well, bureaucracy is obviously fantastically expensive worldwide, especially here in Greece, I suppose. But if we, maybe one club has taken, maybe individually, to look at whether they've seen how regulation aspects have affected their claims and therefore the cost.
Well, I'm not aware that there is any kind of analysis of that. I mean, I think it would be a very interesting analysis to make whether the IG really would be the appropriate body to take the initiative there. It's another matter. Perhaps the International Chamber of Shipping or perhaps Clarkson could be commissioned to do such a thing. You'd kinds of assumptions and gain all kinds of information in regard to relative costs, rates, duties, and so on. It would be, I think, a very interesting analysis to perform, but I don't think the group necessarily would be best equipped to do it. But I'm sure that were it possible, making certain assumptions as necessarily such an analysis would require, were it possible to do such a report, I think it probably would show that most regulation, one way or another, adds a cost. I mean, certainly the kind of, for example, in the case of Dodd-Frank, which is the new act that was passed a couple of years ago in reaction to the financial crisis of 2007-2008, I think Jamie Dimon, who is head of JP Morgan Chase, which is one very large American bank, said that applying with Dodd-Frank would probably cost his bank something like $200 million a year straight to the bottom line, just in extra overhead to comply with the requirements. So it would be more difficult to apply that sort of analysis across the entire regime of regulation that applies throughout the world with regard to ocean transport, but it would probably be a very, very large figure indeed. But it's very, see, one of the problems is that the shipping industry and the points of attack that it faces, so to speak, are very fragmented. That is one of the major issues, and that creates, some of the political problems for the industry by comparison with others that are more concentrated in their profile as regulators.
Okay, so, I don't feel we should vote on whether we consider it's appropriate for there to be more regulation, because we all agree that we'd like less regulation. So, what does the floor think whether there will be more influence, or the ship owner will be forced to listen more to the regulators over the next 10 years, or less? So let's have. I don't believe it. We all don't like it, so that would be a pointless vote. But I think that whether we think by this we're talking about a real difference. Not something that's like to happen just in the general course of the day, sort of, wear and tear, let's consider. Not wear and tear, where we really believe the regulators over the next 10 or so years will really affect our business. So, who believes that it will affect our business in the next 10 years? Does anybody feel like we're going to be sort of stay at square one over the next 10 years, or subject to wear and tear? I think you're well outvoted again, sorry. So that's it. So we believe there will be great change. So I think we'll stop for a quick coffee break, but 10 minutes only, please.